Dozens of retailers testified about how Trump's trade war with China could impact them. Here's what they said. The Trump administration has threatened to place tariffs on all Chinese products entering the country, in addition to a $200 billion round of duties that could be announced imminently. Trump last week said another $267 billion worth of imports could subsequently be targeted. Hundreds of company and industry representatives testified before trade officials in Washington last month about how the next round of duties could affect them. The hearings lasted more than 45 hours, with witnesses allowed to speak for 5 minutes each. Here's what some of those from the retail and distribution industries had to say, drawn from U.S. Trade Representative transcripts. Jo-Ann Stores, Hudson, Ohio. The proposed tariffs would unintentionally amount to a Made in America tax on sewing and crafting projects completed by Americans. As a result, there will be an incentive to move production and jobs away from the United States. Jill Soltow, Flying Circle, Bourne, Texas. Looking closer at the proposed tariffs, we already pay about a 17% import duty on most of our items. A 42% tax on our product would erase any profit margins and would be sustainable for a very short period before we would have to close. Jimmy Chatham, In Motion, Blacksburg, Virginia. In short, In Motion would be severely harmed by additional duty on these items, a problem to which I see no viable business recourse, and their inclusion on this tariff list would likely have little impact on China. John Stemmen, Microelectronics, Hilliard, Ohio. Given that the profit margins on these products are very slim, as well as the fact that we expect to see a steep drop in sales due to this action, Micro Center cannot sustain an additional 10% tariff, let alone 25%. Richard Mershad, Lamplight Farms, Menominee Falls, Wisconsin. We are glad that the U.S. government is taking steps to position the United States as a global leader in cutting-edge 21st century technologies. But we question in the strongest terms how a reduction on U.S. imports of tiki torches and citronella candles can be a key part of that strategy. Mark Werner, Trade in America, High Point, North Carolina. Moving production to a new country is not a viable option in the upholstery business. This would come at an extremely high cost that would require an enormous amount of capital and time, and our company would effectively have to shut down our entire operation for several years. Consequently, we would have to lay off employees and incur heavy losses. Larry Little, Rich Loom Fabrics Group, New York, New York. We have already seen the beginning of a slowdown in this industry as a result of the first 2 rounds of tariffs. Michael Sivitz, Four Hands, Austin, Texas. The economic impact of an additional 10% duty on our products would have an immediate impact on our business. As an initial response, we would implement austerity programs that would freeze hiring and wages and curtail discretionary spending. Our company has been growing rapidly, and current plans call to expand our U.S. offices and warehouses in 2019. These plans would be placed on hold. Jerome Kearns, Homeworks Worldwide, Lake Bluff, Illinois. When we had this in Wave 1, we passed the price increase through and they raised the retail price. So, what this means is it will likely impact, the lower income customers buying our opening price point and commodity faucets and valves, and then they are most likely not to do a project. Peter Berkman, Max Home, Fulton, Mississippi. This will not benefit U.S. producers, U.S. jobs, or U.S. furniture. On the contrary, it will eliminate U.S. jobs and shift the majority, if not all, of the production processes overseas. Martin Silver, Camp Chef, Hyde Park, Utah. Our customers don't have a lot of room in their budgets to absorb an extra 10 or even 25%. What does that achieve? Ordinary Americans will no longer be able to afford grilling before the big game or camping in the woods with their friends and family. Who's to benefit? Honestly, it's not clear to us. Brandon Sparrow, Even Flow Company, Miamisburg, Ohio. For the foreseeable future, there is no country that we can turn to for sourcing imports of these products, which means consumers will bear the financial burden of the increased duties. Joe Calabrese, Illinois Auto Truck Company, Des Plaines, Illinois. Our case is clearly one where the trade dispute between the United States and China, along with the increased tariffs, would only hurt small companies, such as Illinois Auto Truck, a dedicated United States-based supplier and employer, for almost 80 years. Richard Steen. Breathable Baby. Minnetonka, Minnesota. If we cannot make mesh crib liners in China, we cannot bring them to market. The damage to our company and the babies and parents that comprise our market will do nothing to change China's intellectual property practices. Stephen Martin. Step 2 Discovery. Streetsboro, Ohio. As a medium-sized U.S. company, the proposed tariffs would likely cause a domino effect down the entire value chain, ultimately impacting our entire family of companies. Anthony K. Peel. SOG Specialty Knives and Tools. Linwood, Washington. The administrative motivations are understandable. But respectively, we must wonder if this process is beginning to spin out of control. Our concern is that the list of targeted products is now including consumer items, including tools used by the working people and sportsmen. Darren Dunn. Job Audio. Carlsbad, California. It's heartbreaking to me that the government that is there to protect us is threatening my livelihood and the livelihood of my team members. The proposed imposition of tariffs on products that make up 80% of our business would be catastrophic. We would be immediately forced to lay off 12% of our employees with more to follow. Win Kramer. Arnold's Office Furniture. Bridgeport, Pennsylvania. Our customers would never allow us to raise our prices as much as 25% all at one time. We would be forced to close the business after close to 90 years. I don't know of many businesses, if any, that can sustain a 25% cost of goods and survive. And I've talked to a lot of people in the community. And this is all we've been talking about for the last couple of months. Jay Berkowitz. Rebecca Minkoff. New York, New York. The tariffs punish the wrong people, including the American consumer, and leave the playing field wide open for bad actors to continue to sell fake products using our. The problem isn't Chinese manufacturing. Handbags aren't high-tech. Rebecca Minkoff. Mecco Corporation. Greenville, Tennessee. China must be given an incentive to stop injuring our U.S. manufacturing facility, preserve our current employment level, and create more jobs for our communities. Mark Profit. Standard Textile Company. Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm here today to speak on behalf of our 400 hard-working, dedicated American textile workers in Union, South Carolina and Thomaston, Georgia, whose jobs are threatened by the proposed tariffs on unbleached cotton fabric. Kim Hyman. Graco Children's Products. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. While we acknowledge the administration's overall policy interests, putting tariffs on imported children's safety goods may have unintended consequences on child safety that we believe would be harmful. Russ Torres. Wilderness Trail Bikes. Mill Valley, California. Putting additional tariffs on bicycle components from China will cede the U.S. market to foreign competitors who produce their goods in countries other than China. Patrick Seidler. Huffy Corporation. Dayton, Ohio. As I stated earlier, the proposed tariff is a serious threat to Huffy, the over 200 people directly employed by Huffy, and the thousands upon thousands of Americans employed by our industry. Simply, our industry has no immediate viable alternatives to using China as our main source. Bill Smith. Central California Truck and Trailer Sales. Sacramento, California. If these tariffs are put into place, it will result in an immediate 15 to 20% drop in sales. In addition, a 10 to 15% of our workforce will be impacted with layoffs or decreased hours. Warnow Way. Power Stop. Bedford Park, Illinois. My point today is straightforward. The imposition of 25% tariffs on imports of brake rotors and brake pads will serve no role in accomplishing the objectives of Section 301 investigation, but rather will simply harm individual auto owners who could least afford an unexpected expense and thereby quite possibly lead to more accidents, layoffs, and make roads less safe. R. Vinscott. Surfaces Southeast, Miami, Florida. The proposed 25% tariff will greatly impact and possibly gravely injure our small to medium-sized businesses. For example, in my company's case, the proposed 25% tariff is over 100% of my current payroll and is a severe threat to my business. Paul Young. Alton Industry, Batavia, Illinois. We are intent on expanding our facility here in the U.S. This new facility will allow us to assemble our products domestically, but still have to source major components from China that are subject to this tariff. If these tariffs are implemented on our business, we will have to reevaluate this investment and bringing more jobs back to the USA. Michael Roach, Foreign Parts Distributor, Hialeah, Florida. If 25% tariffs were implemented on these products imported from China, there would be destructive consequences to my company, its employees, and the greater automotive aftermarket industry. Kevin Feig, Even Flow Feeding, Westchester, Ohio. Since we cannot relocate production to avoid the additional duty, that means someone will have to absorb the cost. If it is passed to the consumer, this will be a young mother trying to make ends meet. Either she won't be able to afford a manual breast pump, which is the most affordable option, or we may no longer be able to offer one in the U.S. market. Elaine Bobby, Display Supply and Lighting, Itasca, Illinois. A 25% ad valorem duty wipes out our gross profit margin. It would put us out of business. Rob Cohen, Align Hospitality Furnishings, Signal Hill, California. The threat posed to this small U.S. business by the proposed 25% additional tariff is disproportionate. This industry is highly competitive, and Align would not be able to pass this additional cost on to its customers. Joseph Sprarigan, Hooker Furniture Corporation, Martinsville, Virginia. Hooker has weathered some of the most arduous time periods in our nation's history. We have survived, overcome, adapted, and thrived for nearly 95 years, yet, I do not exaggerate when I say the new Section 301 tariffs on products from China are the single greatest threat to Hooker's business. Douglas Townsend, U.S. makes move on trade war talks as pressure mounts ahead of midterm elections. Washington's offer to restart negotiations comes as both sides are feeling the strain, and with Beijing in a weaker negotiating position. Washington has offered to restart negotiations with Beijing as the trade war escalates, a move analysts say reflects pressure on the White House ahead of critical midterm elections and a weaker Chinese negotiating position as its economy slows. China's foreign ministry on Thursday said it welcomed the invitation from the U.S. side, led by Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, for renewed dialogue on trade after low-level talks in Washington last month fizzled without results. While no concrete details were revealed by either side, potential new talks would be aimed at staving off the next round of $0 billion in punitive duties from the U.S. expected this month, the largest tariff measure in the intensifying trade war so far, and $60 billion in retaliatory tariffs from China. U.S. President Donald Trump has warned he is willing to slap tariffs on all Chinese imports, worth $500 billion, saying on Tuesday that his administration has taken a very tough stand on China, I would say, to put it mildly. But analysts say the newest series of tariffs would be a particularly deep cut for both economies, and would likely come ahead of November midterm elections, with recent polls showing that the Republican Party may have trouble keeping its majority in the House of Representatives. The latest data from polling aggregator Real Clearpolitics puts Democrats at a more than 8-point lead in a generic congressional vote for the House. Christopher McNally, an adjunct senior fellow at the East-West Center in Hawaii, said the Trump administration may strike a deal on the trade war before the elections, though he cautioned that the president could easily throw out any negotiated settlement if he felt it did not help him politically. Or doesn't he go far enough? Doesn't he make him look good enough? The administration is faced with the fact that if they go ahead with the $0 billion, they will hurt the U.S. economy quite badly, and things are not going so well with the midterms, McNally said. If you have a big decline in the stock market just before the election, it could swing it in the way of the Democrats. Robert Frankel, a former U.S. trade official and president of the consulting firm Frankel Strategies, also said Trump may feel pressure to reach agreements to avoid continuing the trade war, with the midterms fast approaching, but that he would want to see significant concessions from China before backing down. I think the talks have the potential to be successful, but it depends on the approach that both countries take, she said. The possibility of new talks comes as China is wary of the very painful impact of additional U.S. tariffs given its economic slowdown. with its gross domestic product at the lower end of its growth range for the past 3 years. But it is unlikely Beijing would be willing to concede on its fundamental industrial policies, such as the controversial Made in China 2025 plan, to leapfrog from a manufacturing power to a high-tech innovator. China does look to be in a relatively weaker position, McNally said. There is some economic pain being felt, and the $0 billion would be increasingly painful, which would move them somewhat towards the Trump administration. He, an international trade specialist at the Shanghai University of Finance and Economics, urged Beijing to resolve Washington's fundamental and long-standing problems with its trade practices in any negotiations that take place to avoid expanding the trade war even more. He warned that further escalation would severely damage Chinese industries, China's markets and currency, and its position in the global supply chain. If China does not make concessions now, it will be bad, he said. This is a critical point. China cannot look at this as a game, where the U.S. is just trying to hurt China. Some people in China expect that after the midterm elections, Trump will concede, but this Chinese wishful thinking will definitely not be true. But given the high stakes for both sides, with Trump pushing for concessions from China but Beijing unlikely to give ground on key policy requests, the trade conflict could continue to escalate into what scholars have already begun to term a new Cold War. This is a seesawing conflict, said Ma Jiangjun, an international trade expert at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. Even as both sides try to engage in negotiations as much as possible, the trade war remains a long-term battle. Perfect storm of trade war, higher costs threaten survival of China's small export businesses. U.S. tariffs combined with rising costs and taxes are putting tens of thousands of exporters, and the jobs they provide, at risk. The impact of the U.S. trade tariffs, higher domestic costs for labor, energy, and rents, as well as the risk of higher business taxes next year is threatening the survival of tens of thousands of small Chinese export-oriented businesses. And Beijing, for whom social stability is a key policy goal, is waking up to the possibility that millions of jobs could be at risk if it does not act. In southern Guangdong province, the heart of China's export manufacturing industry, small businesses account for about half of all employment. A growing number of small Chinese firms are in the process of deciding whether to close up shop or move to another country with lower costs that is not part of the trade war. Small businesses in Guangdong are already seeing a sharp drop in orders, even as costs are rising to unbearable levels. Given the growing threat to its industrial base, the Guangdong provincial government announced on Monday a series of measures to bring down business costs, including reducing corporate taxes, social taxes, and land costs. Last week, it also amended a set of rules regulating foreign investment, in which it emphasized supporting automotive and plane manufacturing by wholly foreign-owned companies. James Zhang, 45, runs a company making and selling electrical cables to domestic and foreign clients in the southeast coastal economic hub of Shenzhen. He said orders had declined sharply since the trade war started in July, and he expected a further 30% decline next year. Clients are dumping me. Some of them demanded that I absorb part of the additional cost of the tariff imposed by the U.S. government, which I cannot afford. Some have already shifted their procurement to competitors based in Vietnam or India, he said last week at his factory. Shenzhen, the Guangdong city bordering Hong Kong, has been dubbed China's Silicon Valley and hosts some of the country's biggest and best-known tech firms, such as mobile phone and telecoms equipment makers Huawei and ZTE, as well as drone manufacturer DJI. From a small fishing village in 1978, the city is now a hub for some of the most comprehensive supply chains in the world, home to tens of thousands of small manufacturers that make components for a wide range of electronic and mechanical products. These small companies account for half the city's employment. But the survival of many of these companies is now being threatened as the trade war with the United States delivers big blows to their thin profit margins, already squeezed by rising costs for labor, energy, and rent. The economy in Guangdong is starting to suffer badly. Its Purchasing Managers Index shows the province's manufacturing industry contracted in August for the first time in 29 months, with new orders falling to a 30-month low and new export orders declining for the third straight month. Struggling to survive. At the center of the depressing macro picture is the struggle of small businesses, like Zhang's. His factory has around 800 workers, of which 200 are based in Shenzhen. The other 600 are based in the inland province of Jiangxi, where costs are lower. During the good times, around 2008, workers regularly worked overtime to meet demand for electronic cables, including charging lines connecting smartphones and computers. Life started getting harder 5 years ago, when costs for labor, rent, and energy surged while competition became cutthroat. But Zhang said he was still able to muddle through. Last year, his company earned a net profit of around 10 million yuan, plus 0.5 million, based on 220 million yuan in revenue. But Zhang said it would be difficult for him to break even this year. The products made by Zhang's company are on the list of $6 billion of Chinese imports on which U.S. President Donald Trump's administration imposed a 25% tariff from August 23. So for a USB cable made by the firm that sells for around 0.8 yuan, a 25% tariff would add 0.2 yuan to the cost, and a U.S. importer would have to make up the extra if Zhang wants to keep his price steady. Zhang's clients have urged him to cover 40% of the additional cost, or around 0.08 yuan per cable. But Zhang says he only makes a 5% profit, or about 0.04 yuan per cable. If he were to absorb 40% of the tariff cost, he would take a loss on every cable he sold. I cannot sleep at night. There seems no way that I'll be able to make it this time. The only option for now is to give up everything here and start again with a new factory in Vietnam. Some friends and clients have already moved there in the last few years, he said. I heard tax charges are lower there. People work for 8 hours, 6 days a week, and their salaries are less than 1/3 of the Chinese mainland level, he added. An ordinary worker at Zhang's Shenzhen unit is paid more than 3,000 yuan a month. The average salary in some industrial parks outside Hanoi is the equivalent of around 800 yuan per month, more than 70% lower, according to Zhang's friends. Some of Zhang's clients have already moved their operations outside China to lower their costs. South Korea's Samsung Electronics, for instance, is cutting its smartphone production in China, while at the same time strengthening its production lines in Vietnam and India, targeting rising demand in these fast-growing markets as well as making them production bases for exports to the global market, Nikkei Asian Review reported early last month. Not far from Zhang's factory in a suburb of Shenzhen, his friend Yu is facing a similar tough situation. He spoke with the South China Morning Post on the condition that his full name not be used, out of concern that his comments may trigger resentment from the government. Hu, 48, started his business as a small cable workshop in 2000, after spending a decade on the assembly line at Taiwanese-owned electronics factory. 18 years on, the farmer's son, from a small village in Sichuan, in the southwest, has managed to build up a factory that employs 500 workers who make products ranging from copper lines and plastic tablets to electronic cables. The company had export revenues of about $7 million last year, but he expects that to fall to less than $1 million this year. That will be barely enough to break even, as a sharp deterioration in the outlook has caused a plunge in demand, he said. We began to feel the pinch from this April when the U.S. government started the export ban on ZTE. For suppliers like us, orders were frozen in the following months. Even now, with ZTE having resumed operations, business sentiment remains severely depressed, Hu said. Tax trouble. To make things worse, Hu said, pressure on his business was also coming from Beijing, at a time when entrepreneurs were desperate for the government's help to cushion the sharp fall in exports. We understand that the trade war is a big issue, that even the government has no overriding say. But there is still a lot they could do to help us ease the pressure. We do not see them doing so. On the contrary, the pressure from the top is suffocating us, he said. One of U.S. major headaches comes from updated social tax collection rules that take effect next year. The change in the rules is likely to force him to pay an extra monthly cost of 1 million yuan, which could push his company into the red. In China, employers are obliged to pay several social taxes every month based on their workers' wages. These contributions for health insurance, pensions, and other social costs are paid into the National Social Security Fund. Implementation of social tax payment rules, however, is often lax, especially among small, private sector manufacturers, and the authorities in charge of collection often tolerate underpayment. Both Hu and Zhang pay under 50% of the total social taxes they owe, and, until now, this had been tolerated by local regulators. Local government understands perfectly well that we will not be able to keep the factories open if we have to pay the duties in full, Hu said. But from January 1st, the responsibility for collecting the fees will shift to national taxation bureaus. China merged the operation of local and national tax authorities in July to improve the efficiency and enforce fiscal income collection rules. The new tax authority has access to accurate information on salaries and so has a better ability to enforce full payment, which means entrepreneurs like Hu and Zhang will have to pay a lot more in social taxes every month. That would wipe out their profits completely and possibly force them to close or relocate. A wave of complaints from entrepreneurs like Hu and Zhang appear to have reached the cabinet. Last Thursday, Premier Li Keqian promised the government would study lowering social welfare contribution rates to ensure there is no increase in the corporate burden. Hu said they were nervously following how the issue develops. Rising rents. Another heavy blow to small businesses has come from soaring land prices. Hu said the rental prices for his factory building and warehouse had almost tripled in the last 8 years to 30 yuan per square meter per month, up from 11 yuan in 2010. Rental fees go up by at least 2 million yuan for me in a year. This is crazy. How can the government stay on the sidelines? If this goes on, all the manufacturers will be killed by the landlords, he said. Analysts say many smaller Chinese export businesses will not survive. Smaller exporters, particularly low-value-added ones, will suffer more in the next year, and some of them will have to close up, said Iris Pang, Greater China economist at Ing Bank in Hong Kong. Pang expected export growth for China to slow further, to just 5% in 2019, as Trump slaps punitive tariffs on more Chinese goods. Since July 6, the U.S. has levied 25% tariffs on U.S. $50 billion worth of Chinese goods. Over the weekend, Trump threatened to impose duties on U.S. $517 billion of Chinese imports. Last year, the U.S. imported U.S. $505 billion worth of goods from China. Chinese government data released on Saturday showed that export growth weakened to 10% in August, down from 12% the previous month. On the one hand, the transformation and upgrading of the Chinese economy requires better resource allocation, so some of the low-end manufacturing businesses have to exit, Pang said. But on the other hand, the process must be managed very, very cautiously, as the sector still holds a significant role in providing jobs. The rising industries, like IE, will not be able to digest the layoffs. Official data released by the Guangdong provincial government in late 2016 showed that small and medium-sized enterprises, basically companies with under 1,000 employees, but more than 20 accounted for more than half of the jobs in the province and contributed nearly half of its tax income. In Shenzhen, entrepreneurs like Hu and Zhang have met often in the past few weeks to discuss how to survive. Some of them are considering hiring more temporary staff to circumvent the social tax requirements, or even faking salary records to avoid duties. But the key is the government's attitude, Hu said, referring to whether Beijing would support small businesses like his. I am confused. Is the country just going to give up on us?